Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, again, whenever you happen to be watching this lecture. There'll be three lectures here, shorter ones, for week 4 on the Great Awakening, the American Revolution, and the birth of what we come to call American evangelicalism. So let me start just with a few words of introduction to say that tonight our focus really is going to be on what becomes clearly definable as Christianity American style, right? It really begins to take shape, and we'll have a lot to talk about tonight in class, on Tuesday night in class, about what we're learning about the shape of American Christianity and how it really defines who we are even into the present and some of the current issues that we discuss. We'll talk tonight about the First Great Awakening as what we would call the colony's first truly galvanizing national event. George Whitefield, the most important preacher and revivalist in that era, preached all the way from southern Georgia all the way up to Maine and everywhere in between. And the language and the experience and the emotion galvanized the colonies together, so that some historians actually will make the argument, no awakening, no revolution. We'll talk a little bit in class also about that, what we think about that particular idea. We'll also talk about specifically about the contours of American Christianity and the American Revolution itself. The birth of what I would call not only Christian nationalism or a unique understanding of the way that Christianity informs what it means to be an American, but also the birth of, I believe, what becomes the first clear, definable understanding of American evangelicalism. Not so much a structured organizational identity, but a movement, a spirit within American Christianity that becomes clearly definable for the first time. And so we'll define evangelicalism, and then we'll chart its path for the rest of the term. We begin tonight with a hymn from Presbyterian minister Samuel Davies, who wrote in the early decades of the 18th century. And here he talks about a new spirit of the American religious and Christian experience. And here in his hymn he writes, "Eternal Spirit, source of light, enlivening, consecrating fire, descend and with celestial heat our frozen hearts inspire. Our souls refine, our dross consume. Come, condescending Spirit, come. Come, vivifying Spirit, come, and make our hearts thy constant home." Notice the language of heat versus our frozen heart, the language of heart and heartfelt religion, of conversion, of becoming more and more like Christ, of the devotional life of inspiring and living a better life in Christ than without the birth of Jesus and without the sort of enlivening spirit of Christ in all of us. A new spirit of revival faith begins to take shape in American life, typified by the kind of language that you begin to see in the change of hymnody. Remember, the Puritans sang primarily just the Psalms, but now we have a new language of revivalistic, heartfelt, conversion-focused, affective spirituality. As we begin, I want to talk a little bit about the early 18th century as the context for what's taking place. First of all, by the time we get to the early 1700s, population is booming. During the first half of the 18th century, the population of New England quadrupled from 90,000 to more than 360,000. And in both the Mid-Atlantic and the southern colonies, the population increased by a factor of 5, from about 50,000 to 270,000 in New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and then in the southern colonies from slightly over 100,000 to well over 500,000. Now remember, a gigantic portion of that population in the Deep South were slaves, right? The majority of the population were African slaves. This created both strain and opportunity for the church. Strain because the church needed to establish structure and order. It had to get a hold of all this change that was happening and bring order to it. But at the same time, it desired to bring new life and to unleash the Spirit and to keep the Spirit alive and well in the midst of change, to spread the gospel in wider circles as the colonies expanded moving west. So this was the central trope and the conundrum of the early 19th century. How are churches supposed to become more organized and structured while at the same time being more open to the Spirit in a period of rapid change? Historian Mark Noll invites us to think about this key identity and this key question in the early 18th century in the lives of two key church leaders who illustrate the issues involved tonight. The first I'll talk about is Solomon Stoddard. Solomon Stoddard was Jonathan Edwards' grandfather. He was minister in Northampton, Massachusetts for almost 60 years. He went beyond the halfway covenant that we talked about last week and even allowed all who lived outwardly decent lives to partake of communion. He actually had a fundamental shift in an understanding of the sacraments. He believed that the Lord's Supper was a converting ordinance. A massive ecclesial renovation from the Puritans, who believed that only those who were professed and accepted members of the church could participate in the Lord's Supper. He democratized and generalized and broadened access to the Lord's Supper in the hopes that more people would find active faith and active engagement with the church. He also began to propose a Presbyterian form of government that went beyond just local congregational governance to connect churches more formally across the city, the region, and even more broadly to the colony. So while he was concerned about church governance, his primary concern was the issue of saving the lost, to save lost souls. And during his year as pastor in Northampton, he oversaw what he called 5 harvests of souls that were like mini revivals and re-engaging the spiritual life of the community in Northampton, Massachusetts. By contrast, we have Cotton Mather, who was strongly opposed to Stoddard's open communion and seeing communion as a converting ordinance. Cotton was a colleague and pastor to his father, Increase Mather, Puritan divine, at Boston's Old North Church. He was pious, shamelessly self-promoting, moralistic, and with over 450 books and pamphlets that he published, it was said about him, among others, throughout American history, that he never had an idea that he didn't publish. Mather was the ongoing champion of the New England way, but he also found himself more open than a previous generation to other expressions of Christianity and even to learning from other religions. And while he maintained a much more traditional hierarchical understanding of the role of the church and the relationship between church and state, he also was a science leader. He actually studied all of the incoming science from Europe at that time. He is the one who introduced inoculation in New England and in the colonies for smallpox. While his focus was on evangelism and reform, again, he saw the religious, the social, and the intellectual as a unified whole, just like the old Puritans did. As these two began to present sort of two different perspectives, open to change, some more actively grasping it, others wanting to maintain old traditional hierarchies. At the same time, a group of Connecticut ministers in the early 18th century in 1708 passed what they called the Saybrook Platform. This is that struggle towards order and structure. They committed themselves to the Savoy Confession, which was an offshoot of the Westminster Confession. They also instituted Presbyterian features of church governance. So they created local church consociations, relationships between local churches in the same area. They also formed county associations, right, where churches broadly across an entire county or region would relate to one another and make sure that pastors were engaged and educated and discussing their sermons each Sunday before they preached. And then finally, they formed a general association across the colony and even other colonies, eventually, after the Saybrook Platform, that had more structure, hierarchy, and organization to the church. Many argue that this actually indicated a decline in rigor from the Puritans' time when they were in the wilderness with heartfelt spirituality and Christ-focused faith. But at the same time, it shows that desire for structure, organization. In the Pennsylvania and Delaware Valley, religious toleration led to a heightened denominational consciousness. So although there was pluralism in those areas, each of those groups began to structure themselves to distinguish themselves from those who were around them. Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, etc. For example, the Philadelphia Baptist Association was formed in 1707, and the Presbyterian Synod was established that very same year. So you see this sort of twin tension that we've talked about, creating structure, identity, organization as you grow and diversify, while at the same time wanting to leave room for the new life of the Spirit and revivalism at that particular time. The slave system was finalized and cemented during this period in the early 18th century. We'll spend a little bit more later on in the lecture talking about early black churches, the faith of the slaves, and also ongoing engagement with early abolitionism at the end of today's lecture. By the mid-1730s, we can see clear three distinct religious patterns in the 13 colonies. In New England, we have the heritage of the Puritans, uneasy about the decline of their ecclesial influence, wanting to maintain tradition, and some pushing for renovation and new ideas and new structures and new ways of approaching how to reach those with the faith and the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the middle colonies, we have Protestant pluralism, very many different religious groups living amongst one another, and denominational resurgence. And then in the southern colonies, we see the absolute dominance of Anglicanism. Later on, they'll become much more evangelical, with slavery at the center. And I thought it would be worth taking a minute just to remind you of something that hopefully you learned from your American history class at some point along the way. And that is that slavery actually became more and more pivotal and at the center of Southern life, rather than less so. In the late 17th, early 18th century, right, people like Thomas Jefferson thought that slavery itself would eventually just wear itself out. It would no longer become important as the colony grew increasingly economically diverse. But then in 1794, this is again much later after the American Revolution, but Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And when cotton production became that much faster, slavery cemented as more and more central to Southern life, which eventually leads to many of the divisions that will create the Civil War once we get into the 19th century. But a word again about slavery is important when Sea Island cotton and tobacco and sugar are at the center of the Southern economy, much more centralized and pronounced as cotton became king in the late 18th and early 19th century. With that as a basic background, we now want to begin our conversation of what we will call the arrival of the Great Awakening. We call it, historians subsequently called it the Great Awakening because it affected all 13 colonies, and it affected almost every aspect of religious, social, and cultural life in the colonies. It was not one distinct event, but rather an upsurge in piety and a shift in cultural experience and identity that was shared all along the eastern seaboard of New England, of England's 13 colonies in North America. It led to the growth of the Baptists in New England and all throughout the colonies, the growth of the Dutch Reformed and the Presbyterians in the middle colonies, and it also prepared the way for the explosion of the Methodists that we will see in the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. So again, whole new religious traditions and expressions of Christian faith are coming out because of what happens through the American Great Awakening. The most important preacher of that era is minister and evangelist George Whitefield, spelled Whitefield, but pronounced Whitfield. Whitefield was an ordained minister of the Church of England. He actually attended and associated with John Wesley and his Holy Club at Oxford in the 1720s and 30s as he was coming up as a young religious leader. He visited Georgia in 1738, was involved in the founding of an orphanage, and then in 1739 and 1740 he came back to the colonies, and he began to introduce whole new ways of expressing and preaching the Christian faith. First of all, he preached out of doors, right? In the 1740s, when he was in New England, he preached to crowds of up to and over 8,000 people Certainly that wasn't going to happen inside a church. When he eventually preached in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin took an incredible liking to George Whitefield and said that his estimate was that with his voice and the way that he performed his sermons, he thought that he could reach audiences of over 30,000 at one time. This was a brand new way of communicating the gospel message, and it led to oratorical revolutions and whole new expressions of how to communicate the faith to a larger and more diverse audience. Whitefield, at the basis of his belief, was Calvinism. Now, we've used this term Calvinism a lot. I thought I would take just a minute to provide a general distinction, because it will become more and more important as we go from the First Great Awakening to the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. Whereas the First Great Awakening was not exclusively, but its origin power was in Calvinism, the Second Great Awakening is primarily Arminian. And let me talk a little bit, sort of a general theological distinction about what that means. Calvinism emphasized God's absolute sovereignty and teaches the doctrine of predestination, meaning that God has already chosen all those who will be saved, the elect, and those who will not, or the reprobate, that are independent of any actions or decisions made by actual individuals. It's all about God's activity and our response to it. You may have heard this in Sunday school growing up, that it's oftentimes summarized by the acronym TULIP: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, Christ only died for the elect, irresistible grace, and then the perseverance of the saints. Once you are saved, that can't be undone. Arminianism, on the other hand, associated with Jacob Arminius during the period of the late Reformation, emphasized human free will in responding to God's grace. So the Arminians believed that although God's grace is certainly necessary for salvation, that's the first most important ingredient, people can choose to accept it or not. There's more of a role for the human free will. So they rejected the idea of predestination as Calvinists defined it, and instead hold to the belief of conditional election, that God chooses to save individuals based on their faith, which is freely chosen by the individual person. In short, then, Calvinism emphasizes God's control over salvation, while Arminianism emphasizes the human choice in responding to God's offer of salvation. Whitefield addressed plain people in plain language. He tugged at heartstrings. He emphasized an emotional, affectional turning to God. He even used public stunts in the media to attract people to his revival messages and sermons. Key in his message was God's grace for guilty sinners and the new life in the Spirit that was provided by an affective turning to God. We will actually read and discuss in the primary sources one person's experience when they went to go hear George Whitefield preach. The other key figure that we need to spend some time talking about tonight, as you might imagine, is Jonathan Edwards, right? If Whitefield was the most important preacher and evangelist all up and down the eastern seaboard of the colonies in the 18th century, Edwards was the Great Awakening's most important apologist, theologian, thinker, and pastor. His 1737 book, Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God, provides a distinct summary of the Northampton revival in 1737. His most famous sermon, as you probably know, like we mentioned last week, was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But it was actually not fully representative of his life's work and his ministerial and theological focus. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is a famous sermon written by Jonathan Edwards, delivered in 1741. It focuses on the wrath of God and the terrifying reality of hell for those who are unrepentant sinners. Edwards uses vivid and intense imagery to convey the idea that people, by their sinful nature, are constantly at risk of falling into damnation. He stresses that humanity's only hope for salvation lies in God's mercy, and he urges listeners to repent before it's too late. The sermon emphasizes the power and the anger of God, as well as the fragility of the human life, making it a compelling call for spiritual awakening and also moral reform. Excuse me. But in truth, Edwards spent a lot less time talking about wrath and more about the love of God and the need for the human to turn to God than many might realize if they only read that sermon in their collection of sources in high school. He urged that true Christianity was not revealed through the intensity of religious emotion, but present where a heart had been changed, fully transformed by the love of God to seek God and God's pleasure. Only then could someone be truly delivered to see the beauty of a life lived with the majesty and the love of God. His 1754 book called The Freedom of the Will argues that the will, the individual ability to choose, does not constitute an actual real entity, but is an expression of the strongest motive of a person's character. A sinful human being, therefore, cannot desire to please God unless God, by that miraculous infusion of grace, changes the sinner's character, and in that changed character unleashes the human ability to pursue and please and live life in union with the Spirit of God. Many argue, talks about the noetic effects of sin, that your ability to search for God, even your ability to understand the dictates of God and who God is affected by sin itself, and the process of character and moral formation, of the transformation of the individual. The affect of it is part of his ministry and his focus of the theological structure that he put to play. The key themes of Edwards' theology were the glory of God, the dependence of sinful humanity on the God for salvation, and the beauty of a life of holiness. He studied Newton and Locke and others. He was a gifted author, writer, theologian, and probably one of the most important thinkers in American intellectual history, in addition to the history of the church. He wound up actually in a significant conflict that I'll talk about in a few minutes with his church. They threw him out, and he actually ministered among the indigenous Native American Indians of Western Massachusetts for many years before accepting a call to be president of Princeton College. When he showed up, he met with his first students, and then he took the smallpox inoculation, which actually killed him shortly after that. And his life was certainly cut short. I'm going to stop this lecture here, and I'm going to then turn to the effects of the Great Awakening and then the emergence and the preparation for the American Revolution in our next discussion. So I'll see you then. Thanks.